So economics is the science of choice. What we need to do right now is look at the science aspect of economics. What do we mean by economics being a science? Well, economics is a science because sciences use theory to explain why things happen. So we develop what is called an economic model, and this economic model is that theory that explains why things are happening. So what do we mean by a model? Well, what is this? It's a paper airplane. Well, sort of. It's kind of an ugly paper airplane. But how do we know it's an airplane? It's not a real airplane. It's a model airplane. So, but how did you know it was an airplane? You knew it was an airplane because it had some similar features to a real airplane. It had wings. Okay, it might fly. So it is a representation of real life. Well, an economic model is the same thing. It's a representation of real life. We know it doesn't have all the complexities of real life, right? This airplane doesn't have people in it. It's not full size. It doesn't even have a real engine. But it is a representation. An economic model is the same thing. It's a simplification of the real world. And why do we need models? Well, we create models to help us understand the relationship between things, why things happen and how they're related. So for example, we could take our model airplane and we could say, okay, well, what if we change the amount of air flowing and the amount of currents, and does that change how a plane would fly? And we could test it out before we built a real plane, right? An economic model allows for the same thing. It's a simplification to help us understand the relationship between things so that we can see how change in one part of the economy impacts another. So for example, we could have an economic model that looks at what happens to gas prices in central Alberta when there is a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico off of Louisiana and Texas. Okay, so our theory will explain what will happen. If there is a hurricane that's headed for Texas and Louisiana, then gas prices in Red Deer will go up. Okay, so we can develop this theory to explain what will happen. And why do we do this? We do this to help us make better decisions and better understand the world around us. Because if we know what happens when there is a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, we can predict what will happen to gas prices. And as customers, we can plan accordingly. Oh, we know the gas prices are going up because the hurricane is coming. Let's stock up now. Or as a business, let's say we're the gas station. We know that if this hurricane hits Texas and Louisiana, then that will disrupt the refineries. It means that they'll have to evacuate the oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. Less production will make it harder for me to get access to gasoline, and that means my cost will go up, so I'll have to charge more. So the economic model is that theory that explains if this, then that. Well, how do we get these economic models? Okay, we're going to use the scientific method to help us come up with these economic models. And because the economic model is a simplification of real life, we have to assume ceteris paribus. So there's a Latin word, ceteris paribus, that means everything else equal. I grew up in Texas, so my pronunciation, ceteris paribus, is not is more of a Texas pronunciation. It's not the true Latin, ceteris paribus. But it means everything else is equal. Everything else is staying the same. So if we go back to our example of hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, we're assuming that nothing else in the world is changing that might impact the price of oil, price of gas. So for example, we're going to assume there's no change in the Middle East because we do know that when there is conflict in the Middle East, that disrupts and changes oil and gas prices. So we have to assume ceteris paribus. There's no change to anything else. And our economic model will just explain hurricane and how it impacts gas prices in Red Deer. Nothing else is changing. There's not more people going on vacation or less. There's no conflict in the Middle East changing the supply of other sources of oil and gas. We just connect the hurricane to what happens with gas prices in Red Deer. So we need to be able to create a model, and we're going to hold everything else equal or constant. And so to create this model, we'll use the scientific method. Now, there's a link to a video. It's a great video that someone's put together looking at a clip from Monty Python where it helps to explain the scientific method and the components of it. So be sure to check that out. So there are a number of steps to the scientific method. First, we have to ask a question. So in this case, what happens when there's a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico? We then need to do background research, collect information. What do we know? What do we know that changes the price of oil and gas? Well, we know there are things that change the price of gas, and that can be demand. More customers want gas, drives up the price. We know that conflicts in the Middle East can impact supply. So what else do we know about either hurricanes or about gas prices in Red Deer? Then we need to construct a hypothesis. This is an if-then statement. If there's a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, then prices of gas in Red Deer will go up. Okay, so we create a hypothesis. We then need to test it with an experiment. Now, economics is a science, but it's a bit different from sciences like chemistry and physics because we can't test it in a lab. We can't take a little ant farm, create a hurricane inside the ant farm, and see what happens to the price of gas at the little ant gas station. Okay, it can't be in that controlled setting. So the challenge with economics as a science is that we can't actually control all those other factors, like changes in demand from customers wanting to travel more or less, or conflicts in the Middle East impacting the price of oil. Yes, we want to assume ceteris paribus that nothing else is changing, but we can't control the test enough to hold all those other things constant and see what happens. We have to test in the real world. So we have to wait and see what happens when there's a hurricane in the Gulf and see what happens to gas prices in Red Deer. Now, if the event happens enough times, you'll sometimes see the hurricane happen at the same time there's a change in customer demand, sometimes a conflict in the Middle East, sometimes neither, and that'll allow you to help kind of control or understand what's happening with those other influences. But unlike other sciences where we can control it in a lab and not change everything else, we have to test it out in the real world, and the real world is more complicated. So why bother creating economic models if the real world is more complicated? Well, if we can create a model for what happens when a hurricane happens, and we can create an economic model for what happens when there's a Labor Day long weekend and everybody wants to travel, and we can create a model for what happens when there's conflict in the Gulf, then we can put all those things together and say, hey, in the real world right now, all three are happening. So what is that going to do? And what we're going to do this semester is we're going to look at when you start changing multiple things that impact demand and supply, one might drive the price up, one might drive the price down, which is having the bigger impact. You want to understand all of the factors that are impacting the market and the economy. So we need to create economic models for each of those individual factors so then we can start putting them together and looking at the complexity of the real world. So we ask a question, we gather background research information we have, we construct a hypothesis. If you're looking at like the example here on the right, you might have a hypothesis that says, what happens if, the question is, what happens if we change the price? And you might have a hypothesis that says the quantity we sell will go up, or your hypothesis might be the quantity will go down or no change. Okay, all those are possible different hypotheses. We can test it by observing in the real world. So in this case, we change the price, we see what happens. In the other example, we have a hurricane, we see what happens. Okay. And then we analyze the results and draw conclusions. Did we observe what we think we should have observed? If not, we construct a new hypothesis. So economics is a science. We use theory to explain why things happen. This theory is called the economic model. We develop the economic model by using that scientific method, by asking questions, developing a hypothesis, and testing it. And because we can't really control for all the other things that might be impacting the situation, we make the assumption of ceteris paribus, or everything equal, so that we can see the relationship. But testing that in the real world means observing in a more complex environment.